"Do not drop anything tonight," her aunt had whispered, fingers tightening briefly at her wrist, "because no one here will bend to pick it up for you." And Clara Whitmore had nodded as if that were a simple instruction instead of a quiet warning about the world she was stepping into. The ballroom of Halverston House was already in motion when she entered, though it did not feel like movement so much as a perfectly arranged illusion of it. Chandeliers burning high above like captured constellations, their light striking crystal glasses, silk gowns, polished marble, until everything shimmered with a kind of controlled excess that made her chest feel tight. She stayed near the edge, just as she had been told, her position fixed somewhere between servant and guest, her hands occupied with a small velvet reticule she did not need, her shoulders drawn in as if she could make herself narrower, less visible, less likely to disturb the symmetry of the room. The air smelled faintly of roses and warm candle wax, and beneath that, something sharper. Expectation, perhaps, or judgment waiting patiently for something to confirm itself. She kept her gaze low, not out of modesty but precision, watching the floor instead of the people, the careful glide of satin slippers measured in inches, the controlled turns, the pauses that were not quite pauses but decisions made in silence. It was easier this way, easier to exist in fragments, in details that did not require her to be seen. Fully, somewhere behind her, laughter rose and fell, light and practiced, and she recognized her sister's voice in it before she turned. Isabella Whitmore standing beneath one of the brighter chandeliers, positioned perfectly where the light softened her features and caught the gold in her hair, surrounded by women who leaned slightly toward her without appearing to do so, as if gravity itself had adjusted in her favor. Clara did not move closer. She did not belong in that circle. Not tonight. Not ever. And she told herself that this distance was intentional, chosen, something she controlled, even as her fingers tightened unconsciously around the small metal clasp of her reticule until it pressed a faint line into her skin. The music swelled, violins lifting the room into something almost unreal, and for a moment she allowed herself to look up. Not at anyone in particular, just at the space itself, the height of the ceiling, the sheer scale of it, the way it seemed designed to remind anyone standing beneath it exactly how small they were. It was not unkind, precisely, just precise. She shifted her weight slightly, careful not to step into anyone's path, and that was when it happened, small. Enough that no one would have noticed if it had been anyone else. The pin at the edge of her sleeve loosening without warning, slipping free from the worn fabric and falling in a soft, almost delicate arc before striking the marble floor with a sound that should not have carried, and yet somehow did. A faint, bright click that seemed to land directly in the center of her chest. Time did not stop, not exactly, but it thinned, stretched, the movement around her slowing into something she could almost see between, skirts mid-sway, a hand half-raised, a glass tilting just slightly as if reconsidering gravity. Clara froze for a fraction of a second too long before reacting, then bent quickly, too quickly, her movement breaking the careful stillness she had maintained all evening, her knee brushing the cold surface of the floor as she reached for the pin, her hair shifting forward slightly beneath the light veil she wore, the fabric thin enough to suggest concealment without fully achieving it. Her fingers closed around the small piece of metal, and for a moment she remained there, lower than everyone else, the position unmistakable, unavoidable, her reflection faintly visible in the polished marble beneath her, distorted by the angle and the light, a version of herself she barely recognized. She straightened immediately, of course, smoothing the fabric of her dress with a practiced motion that suggested composure rather than necessity, but the moment had already settled into the room in ways she could feel more than see, a subtle shift in attention, not direct, not yet, but present, like the first change in air before a storm decides whether to arrive. She lowered her gaze again. Returning to her place at the edge, the pin secured this time, her posture corrected, everything exactly as it had been, except that it was not anymore, because somewhere in the space behind her, a voice had gone just slightly quieter, and someone had turned their head, and the room, for the first time that evening, seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Clara remained exactly where she had placed herself, just beyond the invisible boundary where attention thinned and conversation softened, her posture composed in a way that suggested practice rather than comfort, her hands now resting lightly over one another as if they had always been meant to stay that way. And for a while nothing changed, not outwardly. The music continued its careful rise and fall. The dancers moved in measured arcs across the polished floor, and the room returned to its preferred illusion of order. But the small disruption she had caused lingered beneath it all like a note that had not resolved. She could feel it in the way glances began to drift, not directly, never directly, but in passing, in reflections caught briefly in mirrored panels, in the slight pause of a conversation when she stepped just a fraction closer than expected before correcting herself again. It was not hostility, not quite. It was something colder, a quiet sorting, as if the room were deciding where she belonged now that she had reminded it of her presence. She adjusted the edge of her sleeve where the pin had been, smoothing the fabric with a careful motion, her fingertips lingering just long enough to confirm that it would hold, that nothing else would slip out of place without warning. A server passed nearby carrying a tray of glasses, the faint clink of crystal steady and controlled, and Clara shifted half a step back to allow him through, her shoulder brushing briefly against the velvet drape that framed the far wall, the texture soft but heavy, grounding in a way the rest of the room was not. She exhaled slowly, not enough to be seen, just enough to settle the rhythm in her chest, and told herself, not for the first time, that she only needed to remain here, to pass through the evening without drawing notice, to leave exactly as she had arrived, untouched by the currents that moved more important people from one end of the ballroom to the other. Across the room, Isabella's circle had grown tighter, the space around her bright with attention, and Clara did not need to look directly to know when her sister laughed again, the sound carrying just enough to reach the edges, just enough to remind her that she was being discussed even when she could not hear the words. She turned her head, slightly then, not fully, just enough to catch a glimpse of movement through the shifting bodies, and saw Isabella step down from her place beneath the chandelier, the light following her for a moment before releasing her back into the flow of the room, her gown moving with a confidence that suggested the floor itself had been designed for her. Clara lowered her gaze again immediately, but not before she noticed the direction Isabella had chosen, not toward the dance floor, not toward the terrace doors, but toward the quieter edge where Clara stood, and something in her chest tightened in response. Not fear exactly, something more familiar. Something that had learned long ago to recognize the shape of what was coming without needing it to be named. She adjusted her stance, shifting her weight onto her right foot, a small, deliberate movement that allowed her to turn just enough to face the wall rather than the center of the room, as if by changing her angle she could change the outcome, as if invisibility could still be recovered if she was precise enough. The music softened briefly as one piece ended and another prepared to begin. The transition marked by a moment of near silence that stretched across the ballroom like held breath, and in that space, footsteps became clearer, the subtle approach of someone who did not need to hurry because the room would make way regardless. Clara felt it before she saw it. The slight displacement of air, the quiet shift in the conversations nearest her, the way two women who had been standing just to her left moved a fraction closer together, not to include her, but to make space for someone else. She kept her eyes lowered, fixed on the faint pattern in the marble beneath her, the reflection of candlelight breaking across its surface in small, fractured lines, and counted the seconds between each step as they drew nearer, steady, unhurried, deliberate. When Isabella finally stopped beside her, the difference between them was immediate and absolute. The contrast not in height or form, but in the way the light seemed to choose its subject, catching in the smooth fall of her sister's hair, the precise cut of her gown, leaving Clara in the softer edge of its reach. There was a brief pause, long enough to be noticed, long enough for the nearest conversations to quiet just slightly without appearing to do so. And then Isabella moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to place two fingers beneath the edge of Clara's veil, lifting it a fraction of an inch as if testing the weight of it, as if deciding something. Clara did not step back, not immediately. Her body held in that narrow space between reaction and restraint, her fingers tightening once more against the fabric at her side. And in that suspended second, the ballroom seemed to narrow around them, the movement slowing again into something that felt almost visible, almost fixed, as if the entire room were preparing to watch without admitting that it already was. Isabella did not lift the veil all at once. She let it hover between her fingers as if it were something delicate, something that required consideration, and that hesitation drew attention faster than any sudden movement could have. Clara felt it immediately, the subtle shift in the air behind her, the way the nearest voices quieted not out of politeness but anticipation, and she knew, with a clarity that settled cold and precise beneath her ribs, that this was no longer a moment she could pass through unnoticed. "You should not be hiding," Isabella said softly, her tone almost thoughtful, almost kind, but the words carried. They always did, slipping through the spaces between conversations until they reached farther than they should have, and Clara kept her gaze lowered, fixed on the narrow seam between two marble tiles, her breath measured, controlled, her hands still, because movement would only confirm what was already being decided about her. Isabella's fingers tightened slightly, and then the veil was lifted just enough to reveal the uneven line beneath it, not fully, not yet, just enough to suggest, to invite the imagination to complete what had not been shown, and a faint ripple moved through the surrounding space. Not laughter, not exactly, something quieter, sharper, a recognition that had been waiting for permission. Clara did not reach up to stop her. That would have been a mistake. She knew that, had learned it in smaller rooms long before this one. Resistance only made the moment larger, more visible, so she remained still, her chin lowering by the smallest degree, the gesture almost imperceptible but enough to place her face further into shadow, as if that could soften what was already being uncovered. Isabella tilted her head slightly, studying her as if she were something unfinished, something that required correction, and then, with a motion so smooth it might have been mistaken for care, she drew the veil back completely, letting it fall against Clara's shoulders where it no longer served its purpose. The light found her immediately. It always did once there was nothing left to interrupt it, and for a second the ballroom seemed to sharpen around her, every surface brighter, every reflection clearer, as if the entire space had adjusted its focus. "There," Isabella said, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough, and then, after a pause that felt measured, deliberate, "It is better not to pretend." And this time there was no need for the words to carry because the silence that followed did it for her. Clara felt it land, not as sound but as weight, settling across the space around her, drawing eyes in ways that could not be ignored now. And she straightened, slowly, not in defiance, but in something steadier, something that refused to collapse, even when it would have been easier to do so, her shoulders aligning, her hands releasing the tension they had been holding, her posture returning to that careful balance she had practiced for years. For a moment, no one spoke. The music had not yet resumed, and the absence of it left the room exposed, stripped of the rhythm that usually softened these edges. And in that exposed space, Clara could hear small things with uncomfortable clarity. The faint shift of a shoe against marble, the soft intake of breath from someone just beyond her line of sight, the quiet brush of fabric as people adjusted their positions without appearing to do so. Isabella's hand hovered for a second longer near Clara's shoulder before withdrawing. The gesture complete, the intention fulfilled, and she stepped back half a pace, not retreating but repositioning, placing herself once again in the light while Clara remained just outside of it, the contrast clean, unmistakable. "You see," Isabella added, her voice light now, almost conversational, as if addressing a point of etiquette rather than a person, "not everyone is meant for the center of a room like this." And a few nearby heads inclined. Not in agreement exactly, but in acknowledgement, the kind that did not require words. Clara did not look up, not yet, because looking would have confirmed the exchange in a way she was not prepared to give. So she held her position, her gaze still anchored to the floor, her breathing steady. Each inhale and exhale placed carefully between the silence and the expectation that pressed in around her. And then, somewhere beyond the immediate circle of attention, something shifted, not a sound, not at first, more a change in the quality of the space itself, as if the room had drawn in a different kind of air. The great doors at the far end of the ballroom opened without announcement. The movement smooth, controlled, and the effect was immediate. Conversations paused mid-sentence, bodies adjusted instinctively, and the silence that followed was not the same as before. It carried weight, recognition, the kind that moved through a crowd faster than any voice could. Clara felt it reach her before she understood it. A subtle pressure at her back, a stillness that settled into the space behind her as if something had entered that did not need to announce itself to be known. And for the first time since the veil had been lifted, her attention shifted, not outward, not fully, but enough to register that the room was no longer focused solely on her, that something else had claimed it in a way that made everything before feel like preparation rather than conclusion. The silence did not break when the doors opened. It deepened, as if the entire ballroom had been waiting for that exact interruption and now refused to move until it understood what it meant. And Clara felt it in the way the air behind her shifted, no longer scattered by idle movement, but drawn into a single direction, a single point of focus that did not need to be named to be known. Isabella turned first, of course, the motion smooth and immediate, her posture adjusting without effort, shoulders aligning, chin lifting just enough to receive attention rather than seek it. And the women nearest her followed a fraction of a second later, a ripple of instinct that traveled outward through the room. Clara did not turn, not immediately, her gaze still lowered, her position unchanged, but the weight of that presence reached her anyway, settling at her back with a steadiness that felt deliberate, controlled, and entirely uninterested in whether she acknowledged it or not. Footsteps crossed the marble floor, not loud, not hurried, each one placed with a precision that did not need to announce itself. And the sound carried farther than it should have, cutting cleanly through the quiet conversations that had not yet dared to resume. Someone near the center of the room attempted a greeting, a soft, formal address that faltered halfway through as if reconsidered mid-breath, and then stopped entirely. The movement around Clara slowed again, not frozen but suspended, skirts caught mid-sway, a hand half extended and then withdrawn, a glass held just below the lips that had intended to drink from it. She could see it without looking, the way the rhythm of the room had been interrupted, not broken, simply redirected. Isabella stepped forward then, a measured glide that placed her directly into the path of that approaching presence, her smile forming with careful precision, the kind that suggested confidence without presumption, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire arrangement of the evening had resolved itself exactly as intended, the center reclaiming its center, the edges returning to their place. Clara felt the shift that followed before she understood it, the slight hesitation in the footsteps, not a stop, not quite, but a pause that did not align with expectation, and something in her chest tightened in response, a quiet awareness that the pattern had not settled as neatly as it should have. The next step did not follow the line Isabella had created, it angled, subtly, deliberately, away from her, and the space between Clara's shoulder blades seemed to narrow as that movement redirected itself toward her position at the edge. She did not move, not because she did not feel it, but because moving would have acknowledged it too soon, and she had learned, in smaller moments, that timing mattered, that the difference between being overlooked and being seen often lived in the space of a single breath. The footsteps drew closer, each one steady, unhurried, the distance closing not with urgency but certainty, and the room adjusted again, bodies shifting just enough to clear a path that had not been requested but was understood. Isabella's smile faltered, only for a second, only enough for someone watching closely to notice, and then it returned, brighter, more precise, as she turned slightly, recalibrating her position, but the movement had already passed her, already moved beyond the center she had claimed. Clara's fingers tightened once against the fabric at her side before releasing, a small, controlled motion that anchored her in place. And then, as the presence reached her, everything seemed to narrow, the sound of the room pulling back, the light sharpening, the details around her coming into focus with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. A shadow crossed the marble at her feet, long, defined, interrupting the fractured reflections of candlelight, and she saw it before she allowed herself to look up, the edge of a polished shoe, the fall of dark fabric, the line of a coat that carried its own weight without needing adjustment. She lifted her gaze then, slowly, not fully at first, just enough to confirm what she already knew, and the moment stretched, held in place by something neither of them moved to break. He did not speak, not immediately, his attention fixed, direct, unsoftened by curiosity or courtesy, and there was something in that stillness that unsettled the space around them more than any declaration could have. Isabella stepped forward again, faster this time, her hand lifting slightly as if to intercept, to redirect, her voice ready to form a greeting that would restore the order she understood, but she did not reach him in time. His hand moved first, not abrupt, not forceful, simply certain, closing around Clara's wrist with a grip that was firm enough to stop her from stepping back when her heel shifted against the marble, the contact precise, controlled, and unmistakably intentional. The movement was small, contained within the space between them, but it carried through the room like a shock, not loud, not dramatic, just undeniable, and Clara felt the shift the instant it happened, the balance of the moment tipping, the position she had held at the edge no longer stable, no longer hers to control. Her breath caught, not sharply, just enough to mark the change, and she found herself looking up fully now, meeting his gaze without the veil, without the distance she had tried to maintain, and for a second that felt longer than it should have. Everything else fell away, the room, the light, the expectations that had shaped the evening until now, leaving only the point of contact, the steady pressure at her wrist, and the realization, quiet and absolute, that whatever this moment was becoming, it had already moved beyond anything she could step away from. He did not release her wrist, not immediately, and the steadiness of that single point of contact altered everything, not just for Clara but for the room itself, because nothing about it was accidental, nothing uncertain, and the absence of hesitation carried farther than any raised voice could have. Clara felt the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric at her sleeve, firm but controlled, not pulling, not forcing, simply preventing retreat, and that distinction mattered more than she expected because it removed choice, without appearing to do so, and for a moment her body reacted before her thoughts could follow, her shoulders tightening, her breath catching just enough to betray the shift, her heel pressing more firmly into the marble, as if grounding herself against something that had already begun to move. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, just enough to narrow the space between them, and the movement was deliberate, measured in inches rather than strides, the kind of motion that suggested he was aware of every eye in the room and had chosen this distance precisely because of it. Clara lifted her gaze fully now. There was no space left for anything else, and the effect of it was immediate, not because of what she saw, but because of how directly he looked back, without interruption, without adjustment, his attention fixed in a way that did not soften or shift when met. For a second that seemed longer than it should have been. Everything else receded, the edges of the ballroom blurring into something indistinct, leaving only the line of his shoulders, the angle of his jaw, the quiet intensity of his focus, and the awareness, sharp and undeniable, that she had been placed at the center of something she did not understand. Around them, the room reacted in fragments, a murmur that began and then stalled, the faint scrape of a shoe as someone shifted position, the almost imperceptible intake of breath from a woman standing just beyond Clara's peripheral vision, and then Isabella's voice, controlled but tighter than before. "Your Grace," she said, stepping forward with a precision that bordered on urgency, her hand lifting again, this time not toward Clara but toward him, as if to reinsert herself into the moment before it could settle into something irreversible. He did not look at her, not immediately, and that omission landed with more weight than any dismissal, because it confirmed, without words, that she was no longer the focus of the exchange, and Clara felt that shift as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, the axis of attention moving, the hierarchy of the room adjusting in ways that could not be undone. Isabella's fingers hovered for a fraction of a second, longer before lowering, the movement small but visible, and when she spoke again her tone had altered, smoother now, more measured. "I believe there has been some confusion," she continued, each word placed carefully. "My sister is not." She paused, just briefly, the slightest recalibration. "She is not presented this evening." And the phrasing was precise, chosen to correct without accusing, to guide the moment back into acceptable form. His gaze did not leave Clara as she spoke, and the Silence that followed stretched just long enough to draw every nearby conversation into it, to pull attention tighter, closer, until even those who had tried to look away found themselves listening. Clara felt the pressure of it building, the expectation that something would be said, that he would acknowledge Isabella, that he would release her wrist, that the moment would resolve itself back into the pattern everyone understood. And for a second, she almost stepped back, almost tested the boundary of his hold. But his grip tightened just enough to register, not enough to hurt, just enough to remind, and the message was clear without needing to be named. He turned his head then, slowly, not toward Isabella but slightly past her, his gaze sweeping across the space behind her as if measuring something beyond the immediate interruption. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than she expected, calm, even, the kind of tone that did not need to rise to be heard. "Remove it," he said. And for a moment the words seemed to belong to no one, to exist in the air without direction, until his attention returned, fully, unmistakably, to Clara. The instructions settled between them, simple, direct, and Clara understood, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, that he was not speaking to Isabella, not to anyone else, but to her. Her fingers moved before she could reconsider, lifting slightly toward the edge of the veil that now rested uselessly against her shoulders, and for a fraction of a second the motion felt suspended, held in place by the weight of the room's attention, every eye drawn to the smallest movement of her hand. Isabella stepped forward again, faster. "This time, that will not be necessary," she said, the smoothness in her voice beginning to fracture. "I assure you." But he moved first, his free hand lifting, not abruptly, not forcefully, simply intercepting the space between Clara's fingers and the fabric, halting her motion with a touch that was light but absolute. And then, without breaking eye contact, he reached instead for the edge of the veil himself. The room seemed to contract in that instant, the distance between every person, shrinking as attention tightened, and Clara felt it in the way her pulse shifted, in the way her breath slowed despite everything urging it to do the opposite. And then, with a movement so controlled it bordered on deliberate restraint, he drew the fabric aside completely, letting it fall away from her face as if revealing something that had never belonged hidden. The light caught her fully now, unfiltered, unsoftened, and the effect rippled outward, a visible reaction that moved through the nearest circle of observers, heads turning, expressions shifting, the quiet murmur returning in a form that could not be contained. Isabella's hand closed around Clara's forearm, sudden, sharp, not forceful but insistent. "This is inappropriate," she said. The words no longer softened, and for the first time there was something unmistakably urgent beneath them, a need to regain control before the moment solidified into something she could not reverse. He did not look at her, not yet, but his hand moved again, deliberate, closing over Isabella's where it gripped Clara's arm, and with a motion that was neither hurried nor hesitant, he removed it, guiding it away with a steadiness that left no room for resistance without ever appearing to exert force. The contact broke, clean, final, and the shift that followed was immediate, the balance of the moment tilting fully, unmistakably, in his direction. Clara felt it as a release and a tightening at once, the pressure of Isabella's hold gone, replaced by something else entirely, something quieter but far more certain, and when he spoke again, his voice carried just enough to reach beyond the immediate circle. "Stay," he said, and the single word settled into the room with a weight that made it clear it was not a suggestion. Clara did not move, not because she could not, but because the space around her had changed in a way that made movement feel irrelevant, and for the first time since she had entered the ballroom, she was no longer standing at the edge of it. The word did not echo, it settled, heavy and precise, and Clara felt it more than she heard it, the command anchoring her in place with a certainty that removed the question of whether she might step away, and for a moment nothing followed, no immediate reaction, no correction from the room, just a held stillness that stretched across the marble floor and up into the light, as if the entire ballroom had paused to consider what had just been allowed. Her pulse adjusted first, not faster, not slower, simply different, as if it had been forced to match a rhythm that did not belong to her, and she became acutely aware of every point of contact that remained, the absence of Isabella's grip where it had been, the steady presence of his hand still holding her wrist, not tightening now, not loosening, simply there, as if the position had been decided and no longer required reinforcement. She did not look away, not because she felt bold, but because something in the moment made looking away feel like an action that would be noticed, measured, interpreted, and she understood, instinctively, that stillness was safer, that silence carried less risk than movement when the entire room had turned its attention toward the smallest shift in her posture. Isabella stepped back, but not far, her movement controlled, precise, her expression composed again in a way that suggested effort rather than ease, and when she spoke, her voice had regained its smoothness, though there was something beneath it now that had not been there before, something sharper, more deliberate. "Your Grace," she said, and this time he turned his head, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the sound, and the difference between being ignored and being granted that fraction of attention was visible in the way Isabella's shoulders settled, the way her chin lifted by a degree that might have gone unnoticed in any other moment. "My sister is not accustomed to such attention," she continued, each word placed with care. "It would be best if she were allowed to return to her place." And the phrasing was chosen to restore order without challenging it, to suggest correction without accusation. But Clara felt the intention beneath it as clearly as if it had been spoken plainly, a quiet attempt to return her to the edge where she belonged. He did not respond immediately, and the pause that followed stretched longer than the last, drawing the room tighter, the silence deepening into something that pressed against the skin, and Clara became aware of the smallest details with uncomfortable clarity. The faint crease at the corner of his glove where his fingers curved around her wrist, the way the light caught along the edge of his cuff, the subtle shift of his breath that did not disturb the stillness but defined it. When he spoke, it was not to Isabella. "Walk," he said, the word, low, measured, directed entirely at Clara, and for a second she did not understand, not because the instruction was unclear, but because it required a movement she had not yet allowed herself to consider. His hand adjusted slightly, not pulling, not guiding in any visible way, but the intention was there, unmistakable, and she responded before she could question it, her foot lifting from the marble, her weight shifting forward into a step that felt both deliberate and inevitable. The first movement broke something in the room, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, the stillness cracking just enough for sound to return in fragments, a whisper here, a breath there, the soft rustle of fabric as people adjusted their positions to follow what was unfolding. He moved with her, not ahead, not behind, exactly aligned, and the proximity altered the space around them, creating a narrow path that opened as they advanced, the crowd parting without instruction, without hesitation, as if the direction had been established long before the first step was taken. Clara kept her gaze forward, not high, not low, fixed somewhere just beyond the immediate movement, and she could feel the eyes on her. Not in a general sense, but specifically, individually, each one registering the shift in her position, the transition from edge to center that had not been requested and could not be undone. Isabella moved alongside them for 2 steps, her hand lifting again as if to intervene, to reclaim something that was slipping beyond her reach. "This is unnecessary," she said, the words softer now, but edged with urgency that could no longer be concealed, and Clara felt the moment tighten again, the tension sharpening as if the room itself were holding its breath to see whether the interruption would be allowed. He did not stop, and when Isabella's hand reached toward Clara's arm once more, he intercepted it again, not abruptly, not forcefully, simply placing his own hand between them, redirecting the motion with a steadiness that left no space for continuation. And this time he did not release immediately, his fingers resting for a second longer than necessary before withdrawing, the gesture quiet but final. Isabella's hand lowered, slowly, her composure intact but strained at the edges, and she stepped back, not because she chose to, but because the space no longer allowed her to stand where she had been. Clara felt the shift fully now, not as a concept, but as a physical reality, the distance between her and the wall widening, the center of the ballroom drawing closer with each measured step, and the light changed as they moved, brighter, more direct, revealing details she had been able to keep softened at the edge, the line of her shoulders, the texture of her gown. The unevenness she had tried to conceal now visible in a way that made retreat impossible. They stopped before she expected them to, not at the exact center but close enough that the distinction no longer mattered, and the room settled around them again, not into its previous pattern but into something new, something less certain, less controlled, and Clara realized, with a clarity that settled deep and steady, that the moment had not resolved. It had only shifted, and whatever came next would not return her to where she had begun. They did not announce their arrival at the center, but the room knew it the moment they stopped, the shift traveling outward in a quiet wave that altered the posture of every person within view. Shoulders straightening, voices lowering, attention narrowing with a precision that felt almost rehearsed. Clara felt the change in the light first, brighter here, less forgiving, the chandeliers above casting a sharper clarity that left no corner of her concealed, and for a second she considered lowering her gaze again, retreating into the small safety of the floor, but his presence beside her prevented it, not through force, but through the simple fact that he remained exactly where he was, his hand still at her wrist, his stance unaltered, as if the position they occupied had always been intended. The music did not resume, not yet, and the absence of it created a space that demanded something to fill it, a statement, a correction, a resolution that would restore the order everyone understood. And Clara could feel the expectation building, pressing in from all sides, the silent insistence that this moment must be explained. Isabella stepped forward again, slower this time, her movements measured with a care that suggested she understood the fragility of what she was about to attempt. Her eyes moving briefly over Clara before settling on him, her expression composed but sharpened at the edges. "Your Grace," she began, and the words carried more clearly now, no longer softened by distance. "This is unnecessary attention for someone who is not meant to stand here." And there was no attempt to disguise the meaning beneath the phrasing, no effort to soften the distinction she was drawing. Clara felt the words land, not as a surprise, but as confirmation, a reinforcement of the place she had been expected to occupy, and for a moment her body reacted in the smallest ways, her shoulders tightening, her fingers pressing faintly against the fabric of her gown, her breath adjusting as if to prepare for a step backward that she had not yet taken. He did not move, not immediately, and the stillness that followed her sister's statement stretched longer than the last, heavier, the kind that pulled every nearby gaze tighter, closer, until even those at the far edges of the ballroom could feel it pressing outward. When he finally shifted, it was not away from Clara but closer, the distance between them narrowing by an inch that felt larger than it should have, his hand releasing her wrist only to move upward, the motion slow, deliberate, until his fingers rested lightly beneath her chin. The contact was minimal, barely there, but the effect was immediate, unmistakable, guiding her face upward without force, without resistance, and Clara felt the movement before she fully registered it, her gaze lifting to meet his again, her posture adjusting in response to something that did not need to be spoken. The room reacted in fragments, a breath caught here, a whisper stilled there, the sound of fabric shifting as someone turned to see more clearly, and for a moment everything seemed to suspend, held in place by the simple fact of that touch. Isabella stepped forward sharply, the first break in her controlled composure, her hand reaching again, this time not toward Clara but toward his wrist. "You cannot possibly intend," she began, the sentence unfinished, her voice tightening as the words failed to align with what was unfolding, and he moved before she could complete it, his free hand lifting just enough to intercept, to stop the motion without striking it, redirecting her hand aside with a precision that left no room for continuation. The gesture was quiet, controlled, but final, and Isabella's hand lowered slowly, her fingers curling slightly as they fell back to her side, her expression holding, but only just. Clara remained still beneath his touch, not because she lacked the ability to move, but because the moment had removed the relevance of movement, the position of her body no longer her own to adjust without consequence, and she became aware, with a clarity that bordered on disorientation, of the way the room was looking at her now, not as something peripheral, not as something easily dismissed, but as the center of a question that had not yet been answered. His thumb shifted slightly beneath her chin, a small adjustment that refined the angle of her face, aligning it more directly with his, and the intimacy of the motion was not in its closeness, but in its control, the quiet authority of deciding how she would be seen. "Look at me," he said, the words low, steady, and Clara realized, with a jolt that ran sharper than anything before it, that she already was, that she had been from the moment he stepped into her space, and that the command was not about direction but confirmation. The silence that followed was different from the others, not empty, not waiting, but full, weighted with the expectation of what would come next, and Clara felt it settle around them, the pressure of it building, the room leaning in without moving. Isabella took another step forward, slower now, more cautious, her voice lowered as if attempting to contain the moment rather than challenge it. "This is not appropriate," she said, each word carefully controlled. "She is not of the standing to receive such notice," and the phrasing was deliberate, invoking the rules that governed every movement within the ballroom, the structure that defined who belonged where. He did not respond to her, not directly, and that absence of acknowledgement carried more force than refusal, because it left her words without a place to land. Instead, his attention remained fixed on Clara, unwavering, and for a second that stretched longer than it should have. Nothing else existed within that space. Not the room, not the expectations, not even the tension that pressed in from every direction. Then his hand dropped from her chin, the contact ending as cleanly as it had begun, and Clara felt the absence of it immediately, a shift in balance that left her momentarily uncertain of where to place her focus, until his hand moved again, not returning to her wrist this time, but extending outward, palm open, an invitation or a command. It was impossible to tell which, and the distinction no longer seemed to matter. The room held its breath, the movement suspended in that narrow space between offering and acceptance, and Clara understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable, that whatever choice she made in the next second would not belong to her alone. Her hand did not move at first, not because she did not understand what he was offering, but because the space between them had become something else entirely, something charged and visible, and the simple act of closing that distance felt like stepping across a line that had been drawn long before she arrived in the ballroom. Clara felt every eye on that open hand, every expectation pressing in from the edges of the room, and for a fraction of a second she became acutely aware of the smallest details, the faint tremor in her fingers that she forced still, the way her breath settled low and controlled in her chest, the exact angle of his wrist, steady, unyielding, as if time itself had paused to wait for her decision. The silence stretched, not empty, but heavy, layered with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. And then, slowly, deliberately, she moved, her hand lifting from her side, not rushed, not hesitant, each inch measured as if she were aware of the consequences unfolding with it. The instant her fingers touched his, the room seemed to tighten, the contact minimal but unmistakable, and he closed his hand around hers with a precision that removed any doubt about the intention behind it. The shift was immediate, a visible recalibration of the space around them, as if the act itself had rewritten the arrangement of the evening, and Clara felt it in the way the air changed, in the way the people nearest to them adjusted their stance without meaning to, their attention drawn fully, undeniably, to the center where she now stood. Isabella stepped forward sharply, the control in her movements breaking for the first time. "Clara," she said, her voice low but urgent, the name carrying a weight it had not held before, and her hand reached again, this time toward Clara's arm, not to guide but to pull, to reclaim, to restore what had been lost. He moved before the contact could be made, his grip on Clara's hand tightening just enough to anchor her in place, while his other hand lifted, intercepting Isabella's reach with a motion that was neither abrupt nor forceful, simply final, redirecting her hand away with a steadiness that made resistance feel misplaced. The gesture held for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, long enough to be seen, long enough to be understood, and then he released it, his attention never leaving Clara, as if the interruption had not been worth more than a passing acknowledgement. Isabella's hand lowered slowly, her composure returning in pieces, but her eyes remained fixed, sharp, calculating, and for a moment the tension between them did not dissipate. It deepened, the conflict no longer subtle, no longer contained beneath polite phrasing. The music began again, softly. At first, as if uncertain whether it was permitted, the strings lifting cautiously into the silence that had held the room, and the sound altered the moment without breaking it, adding a rhythm that did not resolve the tension but sharpened it, giving it a structure that made every movement feel deliberate. He did not wait for the music to settle, his hand guiding Clara's with a subtle shift, not pulling, not forcing, simply indicating direction, and her body responded before she could consider. Resisting, her foot stepping forward, aligning with his, the motion smooth, controlled, as if it had been practiced though she knew it had not. The first turn came without warning, his hand steady at hers, his other moving briefly to the small of her back, the contact light, but unmistakable, and Clara felt the shift immediately, the proximity altering her awareness of everything, the distance between them narrowing to something precise, something intentional. The room adjusted around them, the dancers who had resumed their positions faltering for a fraction of a second before correcting, creating space where there had been none, their movements now orbiting rather than intersecting, as if an unspoken rule had been established that they must not interfere. Clara's breath steadied with the motion, her body aligning with his in a way that felt less like choice and more like inevitability. Each step guided by the subtle pressure of his hand, each turn marked by the controlled shift of his stance, and she realized, with a clarity that settled deep and unshakable, that he was not merely leading the dance. He was controlling the space itself, the rhythm of it, the attention of everyone. Within it, Isabella remained at the edge of their movement, her presence no longer central but not dismissed, her gaze following them with an intensity that did not waver, and Clara could feel it even as she turned, even as the room blurred briefly with each rotation, the chandeliers above catching the motion and breaking it into fragments of light that flickered across her vision. There were moments, brief and sharp, where everything seemed to pause mid-motion, a foot suspended just above the marble, a hand half extended, a glance caught and held longer than it should have been, and in those moments Clara felt the full weight of what was happening, not as a distant awareness, but as something immediate, something that pressed against her from every direction. His hand at her back shifted again, guiding her into another turn, closer this time, the distance between them narrowing by an inch that felt significant, and she lifted her gaze without intending to, meeting his once more, the connection immediate, unbroken, and for a second the rest of the ballroom disappeared entirely, leaving only the steady certainty of his attention and the realization that this was not a temporary disruption, not a moment that would pass unnoticed. When they stilled again, it was not abrupt, but deliberate, the movement slowing until it ceased, leaving them positioned at the center in a way that could not be ignored, her hand still in his presence unyielding, and the room, once more, held its breath, the tension no longer building but poised, balanced on the edge of something that had not yet been spoken, something that everyone present now understood would not be small. The stillness that followed their final step did not feel like the end of movement. It felt like the moment, just before something irreversible, and Clara became aware of how close everything was, the heat of the candles above, the faint brush of fabric from those standing just beyond the invisible circle that had formed around them, the steady pressure of his hand still enclosing hers, not loosening, not shifting, as if the position had been fixed beyond reconsideration. The music faltered. Again, not fully, stopping but thinning, the notes stretching unevenly as the musicians adjusted to a tension they could not ignore, and the sound of it only sharpened the silence beneath, making every breath, every subtle shift of weight, more pronounced. Clara felt her own pulse steadying in a way that did not match the moment, not racing, not panicked, but precise, controlled, as if something within her had recognized that whatever came next would require stillness rather than reaction. Isabella stepped forward once more, but this time there was no attempt to disguise the urgency, her movement cutting through the delicate balance of the room with a clarity that drew every eye back to her. "This has gone far enough," she said, her voice no longer softened, no longer shaped for politeness, and the words landed sharply, breaking the illusion that this was anything less than a disruption of order. Her hand reached again, faster now, closing around Clara's forearm with a grip that was firm enough to be unmistakable. And for a brief second Clara felt herself pulled, not far, not violently, but enough to register the attempt to reclaim, to return her to the place she had been expected to occupy. The motion created a fracture in the moment, a visible break in the control that had held everything in place, and for a fraction of a second the room seemed to tilt, the balance shifting as if it might collapse back into its original form. He moved before that shift could settle, his grip on Clara's hand tightening, anchoring her, while his other hand came up between them, closing around Isabella's wrist with a precision that halted the motion without force. The contact brief but absolute, and the effect was immediate, the pull on Clara stopping as cleanly as if it had never begun. The room reacted in a sharp intake of breath that rippled outward, the first uncontained sound since the doors had opened, and Clara felt it pass through the space around her like a sudden change in pressure. He did not hold Isabella's wrist longer than necessary, releasing it after a measured second, but the message had already settled, clear, undeniable, and Isabella stepped back, not in retreat, but in recalibration, her composure returning in visible layers, her chin lifting, her shoulders aligning, though the tension remained, sharp and unhidden in her eyes. Clara remained where she was, her balance restored by the steadiness of his hold. But the moment had changed. The conflict no longer contained beneath implication, now fully present, fully visible, and she felt it in the way the room watched, not with curiosity now, but with a kind of focused attention that bordered on anticipation. He shifted then, not away from her, but slightly in front, the movement subtle, creating a barrier that did not block Isabella entirely, but redefined the space between them, and Clara felt the change in position immediately. The protection not overt, not declared, but unmistakable in its intent. His hand released hers only long enough to reposition, his fingers sliding from her palm to rest briefly at her wrist again before dropping, and for a moment the absence of contact felt more significant. Then the presence had, a pause that seemed to gather the attention of the room into a single point. He turned his head then, finally, fully, to Isabella, his gaze steady, unhurried. And when he spoke, his voice carried just enough to reach beyond the immediate circle. "You will step back," he said, the words simple, direct, and there was no force in them, no raised tone, but the authority within them was absolute, leaving no space for interpretation. Isabella held his gaze for a second longer than expected, her posture unyielding, her expression composed but tight at the edges, and for a moment it seemed as though she might refuse, that the tension would escalate further, fracture completely. But then, slowly, deliberately, she took a step back, the movement controlled, measured, and the shift that followed was immediate, the line between them clearing, the space resetting in a way that confirmed what had just been decided. Clara felt the weight of that decision settle around her, not as relief, but as a new kind of pressure, the realization that the balance of the room had tilted in a way that could not be undone, that whatever came next would build from this moment rather than erase it. He turned back to her then, his attention returning fully, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief deviation, and the steadiness of that focus made everything else feel distant, secondary, and for a second the noise of the room, the presence of the crowd, the tension that still lingered, all receded into something indistinct. His hand lifted once more, not to take hers this time, but to adjust the line of her sleeve where the fabric had shifted, the motion precise, controlled, his fingers smoothing it back into place with a care that contrasted sharply with the tension surrounding them. And the intimacy of the gesture landed more deeply than anything before it, not because it was soft, but because it was deliberate. "Stand here," he said, quieter now. The words meant only for her, and Clara understood, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that this was no longer a moment she had been drawn into. It was a position she had been placed in, one that would define everything that followed. The room held its breath again, but this time it was different, not waiting for interruption, not anticipating correction, but bracing for what would come next, the tension no longer rising, but held at its peak, balanced on the edge of something that had not yet been spoken but was already understood to be irreversible. The room did not recover from the silence. It settled into it, as if every person present understood that whatever came next would not return the evening to anything familiar. And Clara felt it in the way the air pressed closer, the way even the smallest movements around her seemed restrained, measured against something that had not yet been spoken. She stood exactly where he had placed her, her posture aligned with an awareness that felt sharper now, more defined, and for a moment she noticed the details again, the faint crease in the marble beneath her shoe, the reflection of candlelight fractured across its surface, the subtle warmth lingering where his hand had adjusted her sleeve, small, physical reminders that anchored her in a moment that no longer felt like it belonged to her alone. He did not move immediately, and that stillness held the room in place more effectively than any command, his presence not filling the space but defining it. And when he finally stepped forward, it was not toward Isabella, not toward the crowd, but a half-step closer to Clara, narrowing the distance between them to something precise, something intentional. The movement was small, but it altered the balance again, the center tightening around them. And Clara felt the shift in her breath, in the way her shoulders aligned without conscious effort, her body responding to a gravity that had nothing to do with the room itself. A murmur began at the far edge, soft, uncertain, the first attempt of the ballroom to reclaim its voice. But it did not grow. It stalled, as if waiting for permission that had not yet been given. Isabella remained where she had stepped back, her composure intact but sharpened, her gaze fixed, calculating. And for a moment it seemed as though she might speak again, might attempt to reassert the structure that had been disrupted, but she did not yet, and that hesitation was new, visible in the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth, the fraction of a second too long before she adjusted her stance. He turned then, not fully, just enough that his voice would carry beyond the immediate circle, and when he spoke, it was not raised, not projected, but it reached anyway, cutting cleanly through the quiet. "You will all remain where you are," he said, and the phrasing was simple, direct, but the effect was immediate, the subtle movements that had begun at the edges halting at once, the room settling back into stillness with a precision that confirmed what everyone already knew about the weight behind his words. Clara felt the shift ripple outward, the authority of it, the way it did not need to be enforced because it was already understood, and something in her chest tightened, not with fear, but with a realization that moved deeper, that the moment had crossed into something larger than a personal exchange, that it had become a declaration without yet being named as one. He turned back to her, fully now, his attention returning with an intensity that made everything else recede again, and for a second the room seemed to narrow, the edges fading into something indistinct, leaving only the space between them, the quiet certainty of his gaze, the awareness that whatever he said next would not be contained to the moment. His hand lifted, not to take hers, not to guide, but to reach toward the edge of her sleeve once more, his fingers brushing lightly against the fabric where he had adjusted it before. And Clara felt the contact again, the same controlled precision, the same deliberate care, but this time it lingered, not in hesitation, but in intention, as if he were confirming something only he could see. "What is your name?" he asked, and the question, simple as it was, shifted the air in a way that felt almost as significant as everything that had come before, because it was not directed at the room, not offered for display, it was meant for her alone, spoken in a tone that did not demand but expected an answer. Clara felt the weight of it immediately, the way the room leaned in without moving, the collective attention sharpening once more, and for a brief second her voice did not come, not because she could not speak, but because the moment required a steadiness she had not yet found. Then, quietly, evenly, she answered, "Clara Whitmore." And the sound of her own name carried differently here, no longer softened by distance, no longer diminished by context. It settled into the space between them with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. He repeated it, not as a question, not as confirmation, but as if placing it somewhere specific, "Clara Whitmore." And there was something in the way he said it, a recognition that did not align with the way the room had treated her, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed, not by Isabella, not by anyone close enough to hear. He turned then, just enough to include the space beyond her, his gaze moving briefly across the faces that had been watching, and when he spoke again, the tone had changed. Not louder, not harsher, but broader, intended to be heard beyond the immediate circle. "Miss Whitmore," he said, the title deliberate, precise, "will remain where she stands," and the phrasing carried a finality that left no space for interpretation, no room for correction, and the effect was immediate. The subtle tension that had been building in the room shifting into something else, something more defined, more fixed. Isabella stepped forward once more, slower this time, her voice controlled but edged with something that could no longer be concealed. "Your Grace, there must be some misunderstanding," she said, the words carefully chosen, but the urgency beneath them unmistakable. "She is not." She stopped, the sentence catching, recalibrating. "She is not of the standing to warrant such attention." And this time there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to disguise the challenge beneath the phrasing. The room held still again, the tension sharpening, the line between them drawn clearly now, and Clara felt it in the way the air seemed to tighten, the expectation pressing in from every direction, waiting for the response that would resolve or rupture what had been set in motion. He did not answer immediately, and the pause that followed stretched longer than any before it, heavy, deliberate, the kind that forced the room to lean into it, to feel the weight of it settle before it was broken. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but it carried further. "There is no misunderstanding," he said, and the words landed with a clarity that cut through the tension rather than easing it, because they did not explain, they did not justify, they simply stated. His gaze returned to Clara then, steady, unbroken, and for a second the rest of the room ceased to matter entirely. The conflict, the expectations, the structure that had defined the evening all falling away, leaving only the certainty of that moment, the shift that had already taken place, and the understanding, sharp and undeniable, that whatever came next would not restore what had been, it would replace it. The words did not settle, they cut, clean and deliberate, and the room reacted not with sound but with a shift that was almost physical, as if something invisible had been moved from one place to another, and everyone present could feel the absence it left behind. Clara stood where she had been placed, but the space beneath her feet no longer felt the same, no longer carried the weight of being overlooked, and she became aware, with a clarity that arrived all at once, that every eye in the ballroom was no longer measuring her absence, but registering her presence, and that change alone was enough to make her breath falter for the first time since she had stepped into the center. Isabella did not step back this time. She held her position, her composure intact, but sharpened into something harder, something less concerned with appearances and more with outcome. And when she spoke again, the restraint in her voice was thinner, stretched across something that could no longer be fully contained. "You cannot mean to elevate her," she said, and there was no softness left in the phrasing, no attempt to disguise the challenge. "She has no standing, no preparation, nothing that would justify." She stopped, not because she had run out of words, but because she had reached the point where the words themselves could no longer carry what she intended. He did not interrupt her, and that absence of interruption carried its own weight, allowing the statement to exist fully in the space before he answered. And when he did, it was not with volume, not with force, but with something steadier, something that did not need either. "I have already decided what is justified," he said, and the simplicity of it removed any possibility of negotiation, any space where her objection might take hold. Clara felt the shift in that moment as something more than a change in tone. It was a redefinition, a line drawn not between people, but between what had been allowed and what would be allowed moving forward, and she felt it in the way the room adjusted again, the subtle recalibration of posture, the quiet acknowledgement that the balance had been altered in a way that would not return. Isabella's hand lifted once more, but this time it did not reach for Clara, it hovered in the space between them, as if the gesture itself had become uncertain, as if she were measuring the distance and finding it no longer hers to cross. And for a second her expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reveal something beneath the control, something sharper, more personal. "She is not your concern," she said, The words quieter now, but more direct, stripped of the careful phrasing she had used before. He stepped forward then, not toward Isabella, but closer to Clara, the movement deliberate, placing himself fully between them, and the effect was immediate, the line of sight broken, the space redefined. And Clara felt the proximity shift again, the warmth of it, the steadiness, the way it anchored her in a position she had not chosen but now occupied completely. His hand lifted once more, not to restrain, not to guide, but to rest briefly at her shoulder, the contact light, almost absent, but unmistakable in its intention, and Clara felt it settle, not as a claim she could name, but as something that altered the way she stood, the way she was seen. "She is," he said, and the words were quiet, but they carried further than anything that had been spoken before, not because of volume, but because of what they implied, because of the certainty behind them that left no space for contradiction. The room reacted then, not in a single motion, but in fragments, a breath drawn sharply here, a whisper that began and stopped there, the sound of fabric shifting as people adjusted their stance in response to something they did not fully understand but could not ignore. Clara felt the weight of it press in from every direction, the attention no longer distant, no longer observational, but immediate, focused, and for a moment it threatened to overwhelm, to pull her back into the smallness she had been taught to occupy. But his hand remained where it was, steady, unyielding, and that steadiness held her in place more effectively than any effort of her own could have. Isabella's posture tightened, the control she had maintained beginning to fracture at the edges, and when she spoke again, the composure was still there, but thinner, strained. "You do not know her," she said, the words precise, but edged now with something that felt closer to urgency than propriety. "You do not understand what you are choosing." And this time there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to contain the implication. He did not respond immediately, and the pause that followed stretched long enough to draw every eye back to him, to center the moment once more around what he would say next. And when he finally spoke, it was not to correct her, not to argue, but to conclude. "I know exactly what I am choosing," he said, and the finality of it settled into the room with a weight that made further objection feel irrelevant. His hand moved then, sliding from Clara's shoulder to her arm, not gripping, not restraining, simply guiding, and she felt the motion before she understood it, her body responding as he turned slightly, positioning her beside him rather than in front, aligning her with his stance in a way that felt deliberate, unmistakable, and the shift altered everything again, not just the space between them, but the way the room perceived them, no longer as a disruption, but as something forming, something taking shape in real time. The music, which had lingered uncertainly at the edges, faltered completely then, the last note dissolving into silence that felt absolute. And in that silence Clara became aware of the smallest details once more, the steady rhythm of her breath, the warmth of his hand at her arm, the way the light caught across the room and returned to them, reflecting something that had not been there before. No one moved, not fully. The ballroom held in a suspension that felt almost deliberate, as if the entire space had been arranged for this moment and was now waiting to see what it would become. And Clara understood, with a clarity that settled deep and unshakable, that whatever she had been before this, whatever place she had occupied at the edges of rooms like this one, had already begun to dissolve, replaced by something she did not yet fully understand but could no longer step away from. No one applauded, no one spoke, and yet the shift was unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but complete, as if the room had quietly accepted a new arrangement without ever agreeing to it. And Clara felt it settle around her in layers, the weight of attention no longer sharp and invasive, but altered, measured, recalibrated into something she did not recognize but could not deny. She stood beside him, not in front, not behind, and the difference was immediate, physical, the alignment of her position changing the way the space responded, the way people looked, not past her now, not through her, but at her, directly, deliberately, and that alone felt like a transformation she had not prepared for. His hand remained at her arm, steady, not possessive, not restraining, simply present, and she became aware of it in a way that anchored her, the warmth of it grounding her against the shifting weight of the moment. And for the first time since the center had been claimed, Her breath came easier, not because the tension had left, but because it had changed shape, no longer pressing against her, but holding around her, as if the room itself had adjusted to contain what had just been set in motion. Isabella did not move immediately, and that stillness carried its own weight. Her posture held with a precision that bordered on defiance, her gaze fixed, sharp, but no longer commanding the same response it had before, and Clara saw it. Not fully, not in detail, but in the way the space around her sister had altered. The circle that had once formed so easily now loosened, the attention no longer drawn to her with the same certainty. A few voices returned at the edges, soft, uncertain, testing the boundaries of the silence, and the music, after a moment that stretched too long to be comfortable, resumed, cautiously at first, the strings lifting into the air with a restraint that mirrored the room itself, and Clara felt the shift in rhythm more than she heard it. The return of movement not as a release, but as a continuation of something that had already been decided. He did not release her immediately, and the steadiness of that choice carried more meaning than any declaration could have, his hand remaining where it was as if the position had been established beyond question, and when he finally moved, it was not to step away, not to disengage, but to guide her forward again, a subtle pressure at her arm that indicated direction rather than command, and Clara responded without thinking, her body aligning with the motion, stepping with him as the room parted once more, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet understanding that the space they occupied was no longer contested. They did not return to the edge, and that was the most striking detail of all. The path he chose led them through the center, through the light, through the exact place she had been told she did not belong, and Clara felt every step as a shift, a small, undeniable movement away from what had been expected of her and into something that had not yet been defined. Her gaze lifted slightly, not fully, but enough to see the faces they passed, the expressions that had changed in ways subtle but unmistakable, curiosity where there had been dismissal, calculation where there had been certainty, and beneath it all, something quieter, something that looked almost like recognition. Isabella remained behind them, but Clara could feel her presence still, sharp, unyielding, and for a moment she wondered if the distance between them would close again, if the interruption would return, but it did not yet, and that absence carried its own weight. The silence between them now filled with something that had not existed before. They stopped near the far side of the ballroom, not hidden, not removed, but positioned in a way that allowed the room to see them without pressing in, and when he released her arm, the absence of his hand felt immediate, noticeable, but it did not unsettle her as it might have before, because the position he had placed her in remained unchanged by the loss of contact. He turned slightly toward her then, his attention narrowing once more, and for a second the room receded again, the noise, the movement, the presence of others fading into something indistinct, leaving only the space between them, the quiet that had defined every moment since he had first stepped into it. "You will not return to the edge," he said, and the words were not loud, not commanding in the way one might expect, but they carried the same certainty as everything he had done, the same finality that left no room for interpretation. Clara felt the meaning of it settle, not as an instruction, but as a statement of what had already occurred, and for a moment she did not respond, not because she did not understand, but because the weight of it required something steadier than immediate acknowledgement. She inclined her head slightly, the movement small, controlled, but deliberate, and in that gesture there was something new, something that had not been present when she had stood at the edge, a quiet acceptance not of him, not entirely, but of the shift itself, of the place she now occupied whether she had chosen it or not. The music swelled again, fuller this time, the room beginning to move with more confidence, but the tension did not leave, it lingered, woven into the space between glances, into the pauses that still appeared where they should not have, and Clara understood, with a clarity that settled deep and steady, that what had changed tonight would not end with the final note of the music, that it would follow her beyond the ballroom, beyond the light, into whatever came next, and that the world she had known would not receive her in the same way again. The music no longer hesitated. It filled the ballroom completely now, confident, structured, as if the space itself had accepted the shift, and moved forward without asking permission, and Clara stood within it not as a shadow at the edge, but as something fixed, something that could no longer be dismissed or folded back into silence. She felt it in the way the room no longer closed around her, in the way the distance between herself and others was no longer defined by absence, but by presence. A quiet recalibration that settled into every glance, every pause, every subtle turn of attention that followed her now instead of passing over her. The chandeliers above cast a steady light, no longer harsh, no longer exposing, but revealing, and she lifted her gaze fully for the first time without instinctively lowering it again, her posture no longer shaped by the need to disappear, but by something steadier, something that held even when she was no longer being directly observed. He stood beside her, not speaking, not drawing attention to what had already been made undeniable, and the absence of further declaration carried more weight than any continuation would have, because it confirmed that nothing more was required, that what had been done would stand on its own. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the stillness returned, not as tension this time, but as a kind of quiet certainty, the pause after a decision that has already reshaped everything around it. Clara became aware again of the small details, the faint pressure where his hand had last rested at her arm, the warmth that lingered there even in its absence, the soft movement of her own breath now steady, controlled, aligned with something she had not possessed when she first entered the room. Across the ballroom, Isabella remained where she had been left, but the distance between them had changed in a way that could not be measured in steps, only in position, in power, in the silent acknowledgement that whatever had been assumed before no longer held the same authority, and Clara saw it clearly now. Not in a moment of triumph, but in a recognition that felt heavier than victory, that what had shifted could not simply be undone, that it would remain long after the evening ended. A pair of guests passed nearby, their movement careful, their conversation lowered as they moved around her rather than through her, and Clara noticed it, the way space adjusted now, the way people accounted for her presence without needing to be instructed, and the realization settled deeper, quieter, more permanent than the sharp tension that had come before. He turned slightly then, his attention returning to her, not with urgency, not with intensity, but with a steadiness that felt almost deliberate in its restraint. And for a second the noise of the ballroom softened again, the edges fading just enough to draw focus back to the space between them. His hand lifted once more, not abruptly, not with force, but with the same controlled precision that had defined every movement since he entered, and he reached for her hand again, not to guide, not to lead, but to take it fully this time, his fingers closing around hers with a firmness that was calm, certain, and unmistakable. Clara felt the contact settle immediately, different now from before, not an interruption, not a disruption, but a continuation of what had already been established, and she did not hesitate, did not pause, her hand aligning with his without resistance, without uncertainty, as if the choice had already been made long before this moment. The room reacted again, not in shock this time, but in recognition, a subtle shift that moved through the gathered crowd as the final shape of the evening became clear, and Clara felt it in the way the space held, not tightening, not pressing, but observing, acknowledging, accepting. He did not look away from her as he spoke, his voice low, steady, meant for her, and yet carrying just enough to be heard by those closest. "You will walk with me when this ends," he said, and the words did not ask, did not suggest, they settled into the moment with the same quiet authority as everything that had come before. Clara's breath paused for a fraction of a second, not in hesitation, but in recognition of what that meant, not just for this evening, but for everything beyond it, and she inclined her head again, the movement small but unmistakable, an answer given without needing to be spoken. The music swelled, fuller, richer, the ballroom moving around them with renewed certainty, but the center remained unchanged, held in place by the quiet alignment that had formed, and for a moment Clara allowed herself to feel it fully, the weight of the shift, the steadiness of her own posture, the absence of the instinct to retreat, and the presence of something new, something that did not depend on the room's approval to exist. He released her hand only after a measured pause, not abruptly, not carelessly, but with the same